Hello, patrons. This is Gary here, and I would like to do a very short presentation in honor of Pride Week. And so I thought I'd do a very short and very simplified view of this in the Indian astrology chart, because this is, obviously a very complex topic. So the reason I'm highlighting that is that although we can look at certain pointers, of course, in the Indian chart, they are just pointers, and it's a very um, nuanced and complex topic. Even just looking here from the many letters we have here with LGBTQI plus, you can add more and more. There's such a spectrum in terms of sexuality, gender, sex, that we cannot obviously simplify this or oversimplify it. I would make a point, however, that in astrology, we are always simplifying things by bringing things out of a chart, tearing it out of a chart, really separating it, trying to, hone into something, and then ideally with the aim of putting it all back together in a more holistic way, so that we're pulling out, planets and calling them masculine or feminine, or we're pulling out signs and doing the same, and then we're all adding it all back together. And the mere fact that we're adding it all back in together shows that we're a complex mixed bag of all of it. We all have a mixture of masculine and feminine traits. And this is quite a controversial topic in our modern day and in modern astrology, even because there's a movement, what is known as queer astrology, where they do not like to acknowledge these kind of classifications in traditional astrology at all. So they will not like to label planets as masculine or feminine, or signs masculine or feminine, or look for signature of, for example, homosexuality or transgender or whatever it might be in the chart. That is not a signature they don't believe. I'm going to show you that is the case. And again, I'm just prefacing this with this sense of that I know it's a complex topic, and I know I'm oversimplifying it here, and I know that there are more layers to this, but we do also do that with astrology all the time. If you know the complexity of your own chart, regardless of sexuality or whatever, that is then obviously oversimplified when somebody comes along and says, oh, you're Gemini rising, that's just one part of you, of course. There's many, many layers. And the same with this topic. So I just wanted to preface that and make sure that there's no misunderstanding there. So here's a nice image. And this is Shiva and Parvati, their union. And this form of Shiva is, very appropriate in terms of what we could refer to as a third gender, which in traditional Hindu thought, there was absolutely no judgment on this third gender, because things have changed in modern times, in more modern Hindu culture, and even just culturally in India, and their view of homosexuality and so on. But let's face it, they have the hijras, so that's very common to experience hijras in society, and they have a place in society, and they're revered by many. They're also, shunned by many as well, of course. And this is what gay life is, for example, it's those people who are seen as, different or outsiders, and are, shunned a lot of the time. But in traditional sense, there is no judgment at all, because they are part of society. They play a vital role. And even in other cultures, in shamanic cultures and more ancient cultures, they would be the seers. They would be the mystics. They would be the priests, They play different roles than the usual, getting married or having children, or before marriage, whatever, building a family. So there is an important role that they play, and that's often forgotten about in our modern age and in modern gay culture, which generally, in mainstream society can shun gay people. And this is an awful shame, because when I was growing up, I had this sense of, if you can believe, oh, I'm gay, so I cannot be spiritual. That was literally my thought growing up. And so that was the culture. That was, the gay culture impressing upon me that there was no place for me in spirituality. But it was also spiritual people who would make me feel that way. And obviously religious people. Um, and of course, this is ridiculous when you go further back and you see the ancient connections with gay people and this third gender, you could say, but gay people in general, as being those seers, those mystics, those people who are able to just be outside the sort of, what everyone else is doing most of the time. Because let's face it, it's more unusual than not. Because there are less gay people than there are straight people, if you put it that way. But even then, we could say that this is a spectrum and that everybody is a mixed bag of the masculine and feminine, and sexuality isn't a straightforward thing, pardon the pun. So another image. This is Shiva and Parvati in union. It's a nice image of this deity. And to the astrology. So I'm going to show you a couple of charts now, but I just wanted to show you where we get this from. So the more ancient text on Vedic astrology called Brihat Parashara Hora Shastra. This is the text that I'm referring to here, translation here. Mercury and Saturn, these are two neuters. Now, I'm not too fond of these words that are used, but it's the translation that's used. The Moon and Venus are females, and the remaining three, Sun, Mars, and Jupiter, are males. So you could use, instead of females and males, feminine and masculine, because in another sense, you'll see the moon actually, and the moon god Chandra as a male, so it's obviously not straightforward. But most certainly Mercury and Saturn would be seen as neuters, or sometimes referred to as eunuchs. But again, you can call it this third sex if you want. Here's Buddha, Mercury, and Buddha or Mercury himself has a very, I'm calling it himself, but you could call, Mercury, this third gender in many ways. It rules the sign Gemini, where we see the, the masculine and feminine come together. But Buddha was born of the goddess Tara, who had an affair with Chandra, the moon god. She was married to Brahaspati, another name for Jupiter. And so that's why you have this really complex relationship between Mercury and the moon and Mercury and Jupiter. So he's like this illegitimate child of the moon. So Brahaspati, Jupiter, adopted Mercury, of course, did the right thing here. But we can see this kind of like this, and Jupiter or Mercury always wanted to know who his father was, and he insisted on knowing who the father was, and it was actually the moon. So there's Saturn, and Saturn is also this third gender, or seen as, when it influences sexuality more so, of course. Saturn in any part of the chart, or when you see someone who's very predominantly Saturn type, if you will, they tend to be people who like to be different and like to shun the mainstream and become the rebels. They're the rebels in our society. So if it impacts sexuality in a person's chart, you can see a different way, and it might not necessarily mean homosexuality or bisexuality or anything, but it might just mean showing a different kind of sexuality. And likewise for Mercury. But when both of these are in a chart, they would show homosexuality and bisexuality. So I'm going to show you the charts that I have drawn up. And the first one is Jodie Foster. It might seem like an obvious one, but I just, I'm a fan, I guess. So I drew up her chart. And you see in her chart, there's a few things that I'll highlight, because there are many things, okay? And again, I'm simplifying it here. On the left-hand side, you'll see her main birth chart, and on the right, you'll see the 9th division for spouse. And so this is a very important chart to use for sexuality also. And this is where we'll be confirming sexuality. And we'll first look in the main chart to see anything here. Now, going back to that image of Shiva and Parvati and their union, and or you can say Shiva and Shakti, the masculine and feminine coming together to create this third gender. We need to look at in the chart, obviously, then the masculine and feminine principles. And the masculine is sun and the feminine is moon. And on another level, the masculine is Mars and then feminine is Venus. So we could see these as the gender planets, if you want to call it that. And so they are simply taking them out of the chart. They are seen as classified as one or the other. When you put them back into the chart and mix it up with the sign positions and all aspects and all of that, it's going to be a mixed bag. So this is why this argument of taking things out and not giving them that label initially doesn't help us in astrology in ascertaining, the mix, right? So in Jodie Foster's case, this is something you can look at in any chart. And again, multi-layered. So don't take any one of these things on their own and think, oh, this person's gay, for example, because this could be in any other person's chart and it wouldn't be the case. But to start with, the sun, which is the masculine principle, is in a feminine sign, Scorpio. So that's one thing we might say, okay. Then the moon, which is the feminine principle, is in a masculine sign, Leo. So that's okay. They're swapping over masculine, feminine roles, if you want to put it that way. Then you see Mars is in debilitation in Cancer. So Mars is the masculine principle and it's in Cancer. That's going to show something there. While the feminine principle, Venus, is in a masculine sign and retrograde. And generally, and this is very general again, by the way, in a woman's chart, when Venus is retrograde, you might look at sexuality more closely. And even if it's not like other kinds of sexuality, like homosexuality or bisexuality, you would still look at it in terms of this area of their life and their femininity. So this is and likewise for a man who has Mars retrograde, you look at their sexuality and their masculinity, how that's expressed in other ways. So there's something to acknowledge here for sure when you see the main birth chart, but just taking the main birth chart alone, you wouldn't confirm that in the main birth chart. You would go to the ninth division, Navamsha, and you would confirm it there. And you would do so by looking at 3 specific houses here. The 3rd, the 7th, and the 11th. These are the Kama houses, the desire-filled houses. 3rd, 7th, 11th. If Mercury or Saturn, either of those 2 eunuch planets, neuter planets, third gender planets, whatever you want to call it, have an influence on any of these 3, then you're more sure that there is that tendency here. Now, word of warning here, because if you start reading charts and you see that in people's charts, it's not necessarily that they live it out, they express that outwardly. It could be a deep down desire that they never express. And, the main chart might show they live a very, quote unquote, straight life, but it could show in this chart that they have homosexual tendencies. I've seen it in enough charts now to know, and people who come to me, because I know I'm quite open about these things, that they want to discuss it more, but it doesn't mean they actually have to, live that life. It just means that they might have feelings for someone of the same sex at some time in their life, perhaps, or they might not express it. So she has Saturn in the 3rd, so that's an indication there. One of the things I've been told, I don't necessarily agree with this, is that when Jupiter also has an influence on the 3rd, 7th, or 11th, that it would cancel out those indications. Where what I've seen more often is that it actually shows a need to kind of, do the traditional thing, get married and have kids, for example. But that doesn't negate or remove completely the underlying sexuality, and if there's that need there as well. So there might be a need to get married and have kids, but there also might be a need for other things. So that's what I've seen more. So that's Jodie Foster's chart. Another chart we could look at is Ram Dass. Ram Dass is not so obviously, a gay man, you could point out, but he is openly gay. He wasn't when he was younger, but in later years, he came out more open as a homosexual man. Ram Dass is a spiritual teacher, You might be familiar with him from that book, Be Here Now. So in his main birth chart, he has Gemini rising. Gemini is an interesting sign anyway in terms of the gender roles. But we're going to again look at you could look at the 3rd, 7th, and 11th in this chart as well, of course. You can see Saturn in the 7th, and then you can see Mercury in the 11th. So that's okay. You could investigate further from there. But we're going to look at the masculine and feminine. Sun masculine is in the water, the feminine Pisces. Moon, the feminine, is in Scorpio, although feminine, it's debilitated. So there might be something to question here about the feminine and masculine principles. Mars, the masculine, is debilitated in Cancer. So Mars and Moon, both debilitated, exchanging signs. And Venus, the feminine, is in the masculine Aquarius. So there's definitely something to investigate here. And especially then when we take Saturn in the 7th and Mercury in the 11th in this chart. But we need to do it over here in the D9. And we do that by looking at the 3rd, 7th, and 11th here. And we'll see Mercury again is cropping up in the 3rd. So this is an indication that, yes, there is some other kind of sexuality, whatever other kind that is, right? We're not always saying that it's homosexuality, or could be bisexuality, or, whatever other kind of sexuality there is. Moon debilitated in the 7th again would indicate some, thing there as well. Now, you could say that Jupiter is in the 11th, so there could be some cancellation. There's an aspect here on the others. However, really, when we look at his life, he lived his whole life as a gay man, but he just didn't outwardly express that. And he looked like a very traditional person from the outset. And he was the guru, the teacher, Jupiter and Pisces here. But later on, he did, come out, as it were, and say that he had always affairs with men. And I think he had a long-term relationship with a man at one point. I'm not sure if he still is. But so that's how you would see it. You can see both influences there, the Mercury in the 3rd and the Jupiter there in the 11th, after having looked at it in the main birth chart. So I know that's a very simplistic view of sexuality in the chart, but these are the first things you would start to look at, the 3rd, 7th, and 11th in this D9, as well as the masculine and feminine overall, because there are different issues mixing up here, as there always are. And it's not just sexuality, it's gender identity and sex as well. And you'll see this often. So for example, in this chart, the main chart of somebody who, and you might not see anything in this indicating any sort of other kind of gender, or, it's Sun and Moon and Venus and Mars, they all seem straightforward, again, pardon the pun, but there might be something indicated in the Navamsha. And oftentimes what happens in that case is that outwardly the person maybe seem very straight, but they might harbor these feelings within themselves that they might never express in their whole life. And I've met many a person like that. And it's just about looking at their chart and accepting that part of themselves, they're accepting their sexuality. So I hope that helps. I hope it gives you some insight into sexuality in the chart. And until next time.